Hi, I'm Melanie Hobbs, Senior Associate Director of Educational Issues. On behalf of the American Federation of Teachers, thank you for joining the Identity-Affirming Classroom Team Thought Partner Series. And thank you to all the warriors, allies, and change makers who day in and day out carry out the mission of empowering schools, families, and the broader community to create and sustain learning environments where students feel a sense of safety and connectedness, can show up as their authentic selves, develop purpose and agency, and celebrate the diversity in the world around us. Over the next 3 episodes of this series, we will be having an intimate conversation with leading authors and longtime friends of the AFT, Dr. Becky Cohn-Vargas and Dr. Debi Zakarian, about their new book, Identity-Safe Spaces at Home and School, Partnering to Overcome Inequity. Dr. Becky Cohn-Vargas spent over 35 years as a teacher, principal, curriculum director, and superintendent in rural, urban, and suburban districts. In each setting, she focused on educational equity and effective strategies for diverse populations. Her work, along with other experts in the field, was integral in the development and design of resources and professional learning modules created by the AFT Identity-Affirming Classroom team. Dr. Zakarian, founder of Zakarian and Associates, brings 3 decades of as a university faculty member, educational service agency leader, and district administrator. With scholarship in responsive leadership, instructional practices, family-school partnerships, and policy analysis to benefit student outcomes, we are so excited and honored to have her here with us today. Our moderator for today's episode is a member of the AFT Identity-Affirming Classroom team, a pre-K-12 math coach, and Vice President of the West Warwick Teachers Alliance in Rhode Island. Audra has spent 28 years in education teaching 1st grade, 6th grade, and high school math. She has been researching and co-creating professional development modules to support other educators in creating and sustaining identity-safe and affirming classrooms, as well as serving as a national trainer in the AFT's Thinking Math courses for grades K through 8. Before I turn it over to Audra to introduce our guest contributor, Vincent Pompei, whose lived experiences were chronicled in the chapters we'll cover today, I wanted to remind you to use the Q&A widget to submit a question for any of the panelists as you watch and listen in. We will get back to you as soon as possible to keep the conversation going. Audra?
Thanks, Melanie. I'm excited to introduce our guest contributor today. Dr. Vinny Pompei is an assistant professor of educational leadership at San Diego State University. Before moving to higher education, Pompei spent a decade as the National Director of Youth Wellbeing Programming at the Human Rights Campaign, the nation's largest civil rights organization dedicated to LGBTQ equality. His most recent work as a writer includes co-authoring a new book titled Belonging in Schools, a place where students want to learn and teachers want to stay. Pompei's work has been acknowledged by the U.S. Department of Education, the National Education Association, the Advocate magazine, and Equality California. We are so fortunate to have Vinny with us for this conversation, as you will see and hear very shortly. Speaking of which, let's get it started. Becky, this first question is for you. In the book, you and Debi discuss identity safety. What is identity safety, and why does it matter?
Thank you, Audra. I'm happy to be here with you and with all of us in our first webinar for this series. In identity-safe spaces, a person's social identities are treated as assets. They feel welcome and supported. They feel valued, and ultimately it turns into a sense of belonging. We all have many social identities based on different memberships, different group memberships. our family, our race, our nationality, our religion, our social class, our profession, our hobbies. I could go on. And they take on different significance as we go through many experiences in our life that come from how we're treated and what happens to us. They shift over our lifetime. These social identities give us a sense of who we are. And of course, these identities evolve and change. And as educators, we're interested in how our students are feeling their sense of identity safety, understanding their social identities. Educational researchers have also been interested in this. And the good news is that identity-safe teaching is actually an evidence-based approach, drawing from a major research study, the Sanford Integrated Schools Program. These researchers explored what things educators did that positively influence a child's sense of identity, safety, and belonging. They wanted to study the impact of an identity-safe classroom experience on the achievement, particularly of Black, Latinx, Asian, and white students. So they monitored identity and identity safety and academic progress through observations, surveys, and test scores. And they had a good result. Classrooms where more children felt identity safe, students of each racial background liked school more and achieved at higher levels. The research also yielded a set of teacher behaviors in the classrooms that had higher levels of identity safety. The researchers categorized the behaviors of the teachers into 14 components that were part of 4 major domains: child-centered teaching, classroom relationships, cultivating diversity as a resource, and caring classrooms. And the research demonstrated what you, who already probably have discovered yourself, that when a child feels valued and validated, they feel belonging, they become motivated to participate, and their academic performance increases. Thank you.
Thank you, Becky, for sharing all of your expertise, particularly that piece around the set of teacher behaviors in the classroom really spoke to me. I just appreciate and know that everybody who's watching and listening today is seriously in for a treat when it comes to listening to this 3-part podcast series, and also when you're able to get your hands on the book. I know that I felt a great sense of urgency in my own coaching and teaching practice after reading it. Becky, from your perspective, what is the urgency for this book?
Well, before I start talking about the urgency, I want to say that I, too, was very motivated by this research. I thought, wow, these are things teachers can do. They're not rocket science, but the way we do them is really important. And so it became the topic of my dissertation to take these teacher behaviors and think about how we can spread them to other teachers, things they're already doing that they can amplify. So I, too, was really excited about it. And in this new book that we're doing, we look at home and school because these are primary places that influence a child's social identity as they grow up. And when the same positive message can be heard at home and in school and across classrooms, across years of schooling, the child has a much better chance of feeling confident and optimistic and having the inner strength to face adversity or experiences that inevitably occur that might undermine their sense of identity safety. And in the book, we interviewed 29 people, including Vinny and 2 of the other people you'll hear in subsequent interviews on the podcast. And we listened to their experiences, both the positive ones and the negative ones, and looked at patterns that go across different backgrounds, different ethnicities, different gender and LGBTQ plus identities, and more. Our schools have many students with diverse identities, and we've also become aware as educators of the epic number of children experiencing adverse childhood experiences. So that gets magnified by the COVID-19 pandemic, which illuminated the disproportionate number of people from underrepresented populations who had higher risks of contracting and dying from the virus, and who had difficult experiences accessing food, shelter, and medical care. And one more thing we discovered when kids went back to school, so many discovered learning loss and their social skills were impacted. So all that adds up to a tremendous urgency to really reach out in a child-centered way and support our students. We also have an additional issue that's been coming up more recently that adds to the urgency. There's some local and state level politicians and parents and guardians who are calling for restrictions on this much needed culturally responsive teaching and on social emotional learning and identity safety approaches. There's some states that actually limit the study and the discussion of topics of racism, of diversity. And we know about the many, many books that have been banned, books that have been so important to help children learn about their history, their families, their cultures, and to see themselves reflected in the school. Also, transgender and LGBTQ plus students have been targeted by laws that take away their rights. And educators have also been targeted by laws that cause them to be afraid to teach these things with a penalty of being sued or fired. So that's silencing teachers. So this current climate has led to increased othering of students who feel different, who are bullied, who are afraid to confirm a negative stereotype because there are negative stereotypes out there. And all that has been found to lower student performance. So a partnership between families and schools, looking at the best way to create identity safety and to inoculate students against some of the harm caused by these attacks on diversity, this partnership is urgently needed. And we know that the research has shown that when schools partner with families, students do better socially and academically. So when we cultivate identity, safety, and belonging, it has a much greater chance of being effective on all fronts.
Yeah, that current climate that you just described, Becky, is the reason that I have been working so hard over the past several years to try to educate myself and become a change agent in this space. And the book that you and Debi authored is a great resource. And you just said it. You said it's about taking things we're already doing well that we can amplify. And I felt that so much while I was reading it. And other educators who want to do this work and be empowered, this book is just a phenomenal resource. So speaking of Debi, my next question is for you. In the book, I noticed the term multi-diverse identities. Can you please tell us what the term multi-diverse means?
Sure. Thank you for that question. And it's great to be with you, Audra, Melanie, Becky, Vinny, and everyone. And that's a great question. What do we mean by the term multi-diverse? So I'm going to circle back to a bit during this portion of the podcast to what Becky talked about by kind of talking about what's happening now. And wherever we teach and wherever we work and wherever we live, society is changing rapidly. We are becoming much more racially, culturally, linguistically, and ethnically diverse. We're also much more aware of LGBTQ plus and neurodiverse communities. In the book, we use the asset-based term multi-diverse to reflect the rich backgrounds and social identities of all of our students, all of us educators, all of us families, and everyone who we work with and we socialize with. Our intent in using this term is to build identity-safe practices at school and to support these to occur at home. The urgency for doing this is as multifold as is our ever-changing, ever-evolving society. For example, during the past decade, as Becky mentioned, we've become much, much more aware of the immense number of students. Literally 68% of adults in the US alone say that they had one or more adverse childhood experiences when they were children, such as violence, abuse, neglect. witnessing violence in their home or their community, or having a family member attempt or die by suicide, and much more. And while all of us, especially children, are at risk of adversity, a lot of research does point to what Becky talked about, the link between adverse childhood experiences and one's health and well-being and life opportunities. The COVID pandemic, as Becky mentioned, the COVID-19 pandemic illuminated the disproportionate number of people from underrepresented populations who were at higher risk of getting the virus and dying from it, and having inequitable access to food, to shelter, and medical care. But as we're becoming much more aware of children with adverse childhood experiences, we're also becoming much more aware of the steps that we can all take to help children feel safe, a sense of belonging, value, and competence. And at the same time, they're hearing voices of others, especially politicians and the media, calling for restrictions and practices that ignore their voices and prohibit us to teach about about their historic and lived experiences. And that has become a very big barrier to the concept of inclusion. And Becky mentioned that in some states, crucial topics such as the history of racism, discussions of diversity, and many books on these topics have been banned. And another important factor is that transgender students, in fact, have been targeted by laws that really do take away their rights, as Becky mentioned. But these trends really call for us to use an identity-safe practice that really looks at how we can interrupt these cycles of inequities that have been occurring for generations by providing a really comprehensive approach that truly cultivates diversity as a resource and an asset. Our term, multi-diverse, is really intended to be an asset-based term that highlights and embraces the rich, heterogeneous populations that we have the privilege and pleasure to work with and socialize with.
So powerful, Debbie. That term multi-diverse is a good reminder, and you use the word privilege. I have the privilege and the responsibility of setting that tone for my learning community. When I really get to know students for who they are beyond the surface, and I find ways to celebrate all of their brilliance and let them know how much I value who they are, they can show up in my classroom as their true selves and know that I know that that's what makes our classroom so great, like their uniqueness and what they bring to our space. So such a great reminder for educators like myself. At this point, I would like to welcome you into the conversation, Vinny. Becky and Debbie interviewed you, and you shared some of your own personal school experiences in the book. Can you share part of your story with us and how your identity was impacted?
Yes, first of all, thank you everyone for inviting me here. It's always a pleasure to collaborate with AFT and of course, Debbie and Becky. I guess before I dive into what I shared, which you'll read in the book, I thought it might be helpful to explain the preface, if you will, of kind of what led to that moment in third grade in the restroom, where I experienced a terrifying, violent encounter with some of my peers. I also think in light of kind of the growing levels of misconceptions about LGBTQ identities and I guess what LGBTQ inclusive practices in schools even means, I think it might be insightful for listeners to kind of hear about when and how I first became aware of my own LGBTQ identity. Sadly, there are many untruths going viral right now on social media and other outlets that really wrongly define the terms LGBTQ with something sexually explicit typically, or that just simply hearing about LGBTQ people will somehow make someone become LGBTQ. For clarity, these terms have nothing to do with sexually explicit topics. These terms are simply identities. And hearing about an LGBTQ person will not make someone change their sexual orientation or gender identity. We are who we are. And I think that's important to kind of get out there before we dive into this conversation. I actually became aware of my LGBTQ identity in first grade, well before I knew what sex was. I developed, like many of my classmates, a crush on another student in my school. But my crush was on another boy. I didn't tell others, including my friends, including my family. I had a tremendous amount of fear, even though I was quite young at the time. Clearly, I was in first grade. Didn't know what sex was, but I knew what homophobia was. I knew what homophobia was because homophobia was rampant. And it was almost this connection between knowing what homophobia was and this crush that got me to kind of understanding, and it kind of came out like this in my head, oh no, I think I'm that word that people talk about in such a negative way. And, I think we naively don't give children credit for understanding components of the human experience, including things like attraction and romance. Children at young ages develop crushes all the time. It's a normal part of the human experience for most people. But I think also romance surrounds us everywhere we go. So just think about books that we read, even family television shows, Disney movies, music videos, songs, continually reinforce kind of this notion of romance. We see as children, couples walking down the mall holding hands, or at the county fair, attending family weddings. Like, it was all around me. So it wasn't just me that understood that there was this thing about romance, right? Sure, children don't know what sex is. They don't know what sexual acts are, but they're developing these feelings that, tend to cause the butterflies in their stomachs, just like we all have experienced. Just mine was a little different because my crush was on someone of the same gender. It was also evident that in this time when I was in first grade, that men were supposed to be kind of expressed in a specific way. Like, we were supposed to be overall masculine, right? Strong, athletic, rough. We were supposed to be attracted to girls. We weren't supposed to cry. We were supposed to man up when we got hurt. We were supposed to play contact sports. So I knew all of this at a young age. So I'm trying to build a picture getting to the moment that led to this unfortunate circumstance. So knowing all of this, I knew that I needed to keep it a secret. I did my best to keep this a secret until I was in third grade. And while I was in third grade, a PE teacher, it was kind of a pull-out system. They pulled us out for PE, and we were playing T-ball. And so third grade, I scooped up the ball. I was playing, I think, shortstop at the time. I remember scooping up the ball and trying to throw it to first base. Well, the ball didn't necessarily go in the specific direction that I intended. And it was apparent to me by the reaction of my peers that I didn't throw the ball in quote unquote masculine enough of a way. And so the slurs started to be kind of uttered. You throw like a girl, homophobic slurs. And my teacher was just kind of dumbfounded and didn't quite know how to react. And her response was kind of clap her hands twice and say, let's get back to the game. And unfortunately, that led to, continuing bullying type instances that then led to this bathroom incident that I shared in my interview with the book authors. So third grade, go to the restroom, and a group of, I think, fifth or sixth graders cornered me, yelled out the same slurs I was becoming used to, held me upside down over the toilet, dunked my head in, and the other one, someone was continuing to flush the toilet. It felt like forever. It must have been a minute or so. They dropped me on the floor. They left laughing. I composed myself, went back to class. The water was now dripping from my hair onto my clothes. The teacher asked me, why are you wet? And I paused. I was scared to respond. I felt like if I responded, that the teacher would maybe think that I'm this word that the students kept calling me. And that worse, that she would call home and tell my family, and maybe they would think. And so the consequence of being wet was, well, you must have been playing in the water. So for recess today, you're going to stand on the wall and while the other students go out and play. So that was my unfortunate situation that I shared. And it was absolutely preventable. And it's something that I think fuels my passion today as an educator to ensure that every classroom, every hallway is identity safe for each and every student.
Thank you, Vinny, for being so courageous and sharing your experiences and your truth in the book and here with us. Your story is such an important reminder for all educators about the impact that our words and our actions and our silence and our non-actions can have, and just what a huge responsibility we hold in our spaces. So reflecting more on that experience that you just shared, what might your teachers have done to help you feel identity safe?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question, right? And I want to just share that I didn't think that my teachers didn't care about me. I just think the missed opportunity was that the educators in my school didn't acknowledge and that bias and stigma, in particular around LGBTQ identities at this moment in time, was leading to bullying type behavior, slurs, violence, harassment, that I don't think any teacher would say they didn't hear that, right? Because it was just rampant. And I think also that educators rarely get meaningful ongoing professional learning to fully understand the impacts of bullying and the long-lasting impacts of bullying, how it's tied and connected to learning, engagement, attendance, mental wellness. And also, how do we do both the preventative piece and the responsive piece? How do we interrupt and make meaningful teachable moments when a biased comment is made? And I still think that it's an issue today. I think a lot of educators kind of pause and kind of because of that discomfort, they want to get right back to the lesson. And so I think my recommendation is to make sure our work is preventative, that we're taking an ongoing approach to addressing the biases that students have about differences, including racism, sexism, anti-LGBTQ bias, and making sure that the curriculum, the content, the general instruction, the examples that we're using in class are representative of the broad diversity of our communities. Each student needs to see themselves reflected back at them in a positive light to build that self-esteem and self-worth. And students need to see difference to chip away at biases so that we can promote kindness and respect. And so I do want to give kudos to the school district that I grew up in, because once they heard about the work that I was doing, helping schools on LGBTQ inclusion efforts, they hired me to come back. And it was a full circle, profound. I'm getting goosebumps talking about it because it was my chance to speak to the educators in this district about what I experienced, but more importantly, the opportunity for them to prevent this from ever happening to another child.
I really appreciate all of those examples. I also really appreciate your framing, Vinny, that this is an opportunity. We do have an opportunity right now. And that idea of preventative and responsiveness when it comes to bias, and myself and other educators getting better at pausing and having those courageous conversations when we need to it's huge. I know I'm always trying to get better, so I appreciate the opportunity to learn from you and your experience and expertise. I'm going to turn this back to Becky for a moment. Becky, the book describes the harm of being colorblind or ignoring differences. Some people claim that acknowledging differences is divisive. Can you explain why you disagree with this? And can you share some examples?
Sure. I think Vinny shared the power of bullying experiences that last way beyond the moment that they occur and really impact people. And we also know about the impact of negative stereotypes. When people hear their group, jokes made about their group, and different stereotypes that are out there, like some of the kids have heard the stereotypes about immigrants that are going that make them sound like they're criminals. This kind of thing has a great impact. But there's another way that people are impacted. It's by ignoring differences. It's a kind of erasure. You're erasing a person's identity when you try and act like, oh, we're all the same. And we have a saying in Yiddish that when someone feels ignored, it goes like this: what do you think I am, chopped liver? But that is how it feels when people say they do not see differences and they treat everyone both the same. It's not true. Even babies notice differences, and babies also sense the reactions of their parents and people around them when they do notice a difference and that difference is disparaged in some way. There are people and educators who say, I'm colorblind, I do not see color. But for people who are marginalized already and they feel somehow that they don't belong, this ignoring of differences causes them to feel invisible or excluded. I'll give you an example. My daughter is married to a woman and she has a 3-year-old son who I love dearly named Anteo. And so Anteo has 2 mothers. Now, when he sees books with pictures of children who have a mother and a father, but never a book with children who have 2 mothers or 2 fathers, or when it's Father's Day, and this already happened in preschool, everyone's making Father's Day cards. How might he feel? In his preschool, he made Grandfather's Day cards because he has 2 grandfathers. You really have to know your students because not all children have a father and grandfather or grandfathers. But if you don't try and think of what it feels like to a child who has a difference of some kind, it causes that child to think, what's wrong with me? And for children who feel different for some aspect of their identity, and when it's ignored, they can feel shame and even try to hide the identity, in this case of having same-sex parents. But other people change their name to hide their identity. And some people can't hide those aspects of their identity. Certainly the color of their skin that can't be hidden. So shame is felt when people act like there are no differences. In identity safety, we treat differences as a good thing. We point out that our differences make us stronger. We highlight differences in ways that are very thoughtful and do not make a person feel singled out or that they're exotic. The teachers in my grandson's preschool didn't make a big deal that he was making a grandfather card. They just created the opportunity. And we create opportunities to share where children can share about their lives and cultures without making it stand out in some unique way, because nobody wants to feel like a token or they want to be made to feel like some exotic different thing. We want people to feel their differences in ways that are positive. And we provide meaningful ways for people to have an opportunity to share about their identities. For example, in our book, we give us an example of 2 kindergarten students. This came out in one of our interviews. And their parents came from the Philippines, and they didn't know that they spoke the same language. And they were sitting at the table, and they discovered, wow, that we speak the same language. These are kindergarten kids. And their language was Tagalog. And they began talking. And then a 3rd child sitting at that table who didn't understand them said, I can speak gibberish, and started to make funny sounds. So the teacher walked up, and it wasn't the teacher who we interviewed. The teacher said, let's talk English so everyone could be included. That was an attempt to create belonging, but it also involved erasure. It involved ignoring the fact that kids didn't speak another language. So in the book, we actually propose ways to validate the students' languages in a way that doesn't make anyone feel left out. And you, I'm sure, as you listen, can think of different ways to do that. But one way would be to have the kids who spoke Tagalog speak teach the other kids in the class some words, or maybe teach that boy some words in their language. So everyone could feel included and they could feel validated having this unique language. And we highlight the value of being able to speak more than one language. In nature, diversity makes an ecosystem stronger. And that's true for our social environment. So infusing ways to honor diversity in our students can be natural and part of everyday things we do. One teacher I've worked with had silent reading after lunch. She was from India, so she brought some Indian music. And she invited her students to bring music to share. So every day they'd have different music during this little silent reading time. She paved the way, and that allowed children whose languages were other than English to bring music in their languages. And students started bringing all kinds of different music, including popular music that they hear on the radio here in English. So it just made it natural. My husband's daughter Priscilla, who's now 45, came to the US and lived with me as she grew up. And she actually came at the age of 8, and she learned English. And as she was learning English, they had a poetry contest, and there was a poem. She wrote it in English, and you may have heard of it. It's called I'm the Child of, or maybe you've heard of it as I Am From. It's a type of poem where children can write anything they choose about their lives, their homes, their families. And if you were interested in finding out more, we can put it also in our resources. The Children's Literacy Initiative, if you Google it, has guidelines for writing I Am From poems. It's a beautiful way for children to share. And Priscilla actually won a poetry contest. I looked for the poem to read to you and couldn't find it, but I did find the certificate that she won $10 in this poetry contest as a newcomer to this country. Each situation is unique. If you have students who are refugees who've lived through war, that may not be the activity you choose to have them do. But another teacher also had a very cool activity called the ABCs of Me, allowing each child to choose what to share and how they want to say it. So there are many, many ways to not have a colorblind environment and share from our diversity in ways that make people learn to appreciate each other and feel identity safe.
Thank you, Becky. I appreciate you surfacing this idea of colorblindness. Our system, our education system, has been marginalizing so many groups of students for so long. And not because we're bad people, but in many cases, we didn't know better. We didn't know a lot of the things that you share so eloquently in your book. But Vinny just said it a few minutes ago. You know, once we have this knowledge, we have this opportunity to do better. And I found myself smiling while you were telling your stories. And I know as teachers, we appreciate a balance of, yes, this is based in research, sort of the why, but also those very real examples and the specifics around how I can make this happen in my classroom. And you and Debbie do an amazing job of providing all three. So now I know that everyone who's listening knows I was telling the truth at the beginning, that this book and these people are amazing, and we have so much to learn from them. So continuing with that thread, one thing I saw in the book, a concept that stood out to me, was this term, a culture of caring. And this was mentioned as a first step in fostering identity safety. Debbie, can you explain this concept?
Yeah, sure. And, you know, it's great that Becky just talked about, you know, her experience with her child learning a new language and some of the features of this kids go through who are multilingual learners. And, you know, culture is something that we don't often think about. You know, what is a culture of caring? And it's helpful to think about the term culture first. And in the book, we draw from Henry Truba, a scholar, and his definition of culture, and also cultural way of being as a way of communicating, acting, what we know from what we've learned in terms of what we've observed and learned, and what those shared rules are, what's both obvious and unspoken, like what Vinny shared about his personal experience, what was obvious and unspoken about what he had heard and thought about different terms, and what his own reaction was to that, and what his classmates' sort of vicious reaction was to that. it's really culture is how we see things, what we believe, how we judge, and how we behave. And that's really what the term culture means. So a great example of culture as a way of being and acting, along with what Vinny and what Becky shared, is the very typical open house night that many high schools hold, where parents and guardians, whether they're two-parent, a single parent, a grandparent, a foster parent, unrelated people who live together, or whatever the family constellation is, they know to come to their child's high school and to typically stand in lines arranged in alphabetical groupings by their last name and get their child's schedule. And then they follow the schedule to go from one class to another, where they know to listen passively to what teachers share about their child's class. And if we think about it, we go to that open house experience, as many of us do, and we kind of typically know the rules for being and acting. But think of ourselves as parents of newcomers who are from other countries. And this ritual and its rules of being and acting may be very foreign, and families may not know what to do and have no frame of reference for this traditional American activity, and might not understand enough English to make meaning of the whole open house concept. So all of us have to think about how we can support the life of our schools, including families of multi-diverse students. How can we make everybody feel a sense of caring about and caring for each other and having a true appreciation for all of our students? In the example that I just gave about the open house concept, what would it mean? To some degree, it would mean asking ourselves and our students and their families, what pre-activities and activities should we do to really support everyone to be welcomed at our school, included in our school, and especially including those who are new to our country and new to our language? Building that sense of caring about and caring for everyone really means taking those additional steps to truly embrace the multi-diverse members of our school community.
Thank you for that, Debbie. This notion that it's my job to actively figure out what families need to feel welcome and supported and cared for is an important one, because I think as teachers, we often assume we know what families need. And this idea that we don't know, and we can only find out if we ask the families, ask the students, it's a really important piece for us to reflect on in our own practice. So I really appreciate you sharing that. I feel like I'm asking you all the questions about concepts and phrases, because I have another one for you, Debbie. Can you tell us a little bit about a strength-based approach, which is another piece that you talked about quite a bit in the book, and also why is it important?
Thanks. That's a great question. And we spend a lot of time in the book discussing the wonderful aspects of using a strength-based approach and the research behind it, which has existed for the past 3 decades or since the 1990s. There's a tremendous amount of research and evidence that points to the urgency for acknowledging and valuing every student, every family, and our own unique personal, social, cultural, language, and academic attributes and more. Abraham Maslow, who many of us educators are familiar with, he first introduced the urgency of focusing our attention to the positive characteristics that all humans possess instead of focusing on deficits. And then expert scholars, Moll, Amonte, Neff, and Gonzalez, who studied families, demonstrated the importance of using an asset-based approach with them. They coined the term funds of knowledge to describe the expertise and skills that all parents, all families possess, and the positives of what can happen when we draw from the tremendous resources that they possess. The research on strength-based practices is also bolstered by what we now know as culturally sustaining practices. These call for us to embrace in our deeds and our actions the rapidly changing student and family populations that are entering our schools by truly taking time to identify and acknowledge their strengths instead of what we perceive as missing in their learning or even in their lives. An example of what we mean are the perceptions that occurred in the aftermath of the hurricanes that devastated Puerto Rico, the U.S. Virgin Islands, and portions of Houston and Miami. Thousands of students moved with and without their parents to communities that represented cultures, languages, climates, and other characteristics that were quite distinct from their home communities. And many educators perceive such students as having deficits, such as, oh no, they don't speak English, or they perceive them as having so much loss that they might have used phrases like, oh, those poor students lost everything. And it was so hard for them to see the many strengths that the same students and families possessed and enacted as a demonstration of their remarkable resilience. Examples such as these and many, many others require that we begin looking beyond the surface of what we teach and who we perceive that we teach to how we can be more responsive and embracing to truly meet the dynamic changes that are occurring both in our student as well as our family populations.
Thank you, Debbie, for all of that great information and those very real examples about the strength-based approach and where sometimes we fall apart. I connected so much to your reference to the idea of lifting up and truly valuing the funds of knowledge that students bring to our classrooms. As you all know, I'm a math coach, and I spend a lot of time working with teachers on both affirming who students are and also helping to grow and nurture a positive math identity. It's actually a module through IAC that Melanie and I collaborated on together. We've worked on ways to help teachers do this well. And we are laser focused on building opportunities in the math classroom where we can elevate students' lived experiences as it relates to the math, and also elevate student ideas about the math. And the importance of setting the tone in our classrooms that your funds of knowledge that you bring to my space are what I value the most in the learning process is always the goal, because every single child has so much brilliance to offer. And I think that funds of knowledge piece again has such a strong connection here. So I appreciate that being a big part of that strength-based approach. Speaking of brilliance, the next question is coming back to you, Vinny. In the book, you explain the essential role schools can play to educate and help parents to support LGBTQ+ youth. Can you explain why this is so important and what educators can do?
Yeah, I'm thinking of a response that might be two-part. And so I want to start by talking about how schools are kind of investing more time with family caregiver engagement, which is great, and we need to celebrate that. There's a lot of evidence on family and caregiver engagement and how that positively contributes to learning, engagement, and mental wellness, right? So win-win, but how we do it is really important. So in these efforts, I think schools need to be open to professional learning. We have to make sure that we're not centering whiteness or one type of family or caregiver structure, that educators know how to do this already without any help or support from others, so that we're being intentional about how we're engaging families. A couple of questions I tend to ask educators when they're working on family engagement is, hey, what does your registration form look like when a parent or a caregiver is putting their information? Does it say mom's name and dad's name? Is the school still doing things like father-daughter dance or moms and muffins, right? Does the school define family caregiver engagement that does not allow for that does not align, I guess, with how the diverse community might define what family engagement means to them. So I think that's really important, that if we want to be intentionally inclusive and engage diverse families, that we take a pause and I guess be honest with where our knowledge is and how can we get support so that we are engaging the community in meaningful ways. And that, of course, includes LGBT-headed families or families with LGBTQ students. The second part of my answer, I think, has to do with transparency. I think schools often hesitate to do LGBTQ inclusion work because they're worried about, parent pushback or parents getting upset. But if we're transparent about it and we remind ourselves that what we are doing to create an LGBTQ inclusive environment is not connected to the myth truths and the misconceptions that are kind of viral on social media right now. LGBTQ inclusive practices has nothing to do with anything sexually explicit. We're not recruiting kids. We're not talking about ideologies. We're talking about identities and identity safety for the means to make sure that students can be successful at school and can just be a student and not have to be at school managing kind of their safety. I think sometimes parents get upset because they don't know, right? So that transparency piece is important. Schools collect school climate related data. If we're spending time analyzing and disaggregating that data, guess what we're going to find? Unfortunate disparities when we look at students by demographic, including students who identify as LGBTQ. As educators, and I don't think any parent or caregiver would dismiss this, that schools have an obligation to each and every child to make sure schools are safe. So being open and transparent about what the data says, the why are we doing this, and let us explain to you what we're doing and the research behind it, and how these actions and these practices will not only benefit the students who are minoritized according to the school climate related data, but also their child as well. Sometimes people forget that just witnessing an act of bullying or violence impacts that individual who witnessed it, right? It impacts them in profound ways. It is incumbent upon all of us to ensure that bullying type behavior is not happening in school for the benefit of every single child at that school. There's a couple of actions that folks can take, ongoing professional learning, not only for educators, but for family members and caregivers. On this topic, the school can create an LGBTQ resource page where they can put information on policies, laws, and best practices and resources for families, how to understand what acceptance looks like and the importance of acceptance if they have an LGBTQ child. Even the National PTA has an LGBTQ resource webpage. So these are just some, I think, easy things that schools can start to have conversations about to make sure that, again, they're being transparent, they're providing resources, and most importantly, they're being intentional about it being inclusive.
Thank you again, Vinny, for sharing just your incredible wealth of knowledge and just being willing to share so we can all do better. You said something there that I was jotting down and I think should be on a t-shirt. Pause and be honest with where our knowledge is. We need to do that. We have to be honest and we have to find ways, as you said, to get the support we need to engage our community in, and you use the words intentional and meaningful ways. It's just such a great reminder to me. I'm taking that away from what you said. Pause and be honest with where you are. Debbie, the very last question is for you. It's very much related to what Vinny just said. You and Becky described the urgency for creating a working group made up of parents, guardians, and educators to promote identity safety, kind of taking it all the way back to the beginning. Can you explain, one, why that teamwork is important, and two, the steps schools can take to create those working groups?
Audra, thank you for your question. And I love that you thought of a t-shirt and what it should say. Going along that theme, I want to talk about why working groups are so important. And one of the answers is we cannot live in silos on our own, especially as our schools are becoming more multi-diverse. In fact, the U.S. Department of Education supports our moving out of silos in favor of working together, collaborating together, and being fully committed to moving away from a deficit-based stance in favor of using a strength-based policies, practices, structures, and most importantly, having interactions and lots of them that show our interest, our curiosity, our willingness to be open and flexible and caring about one another. Identity-safe homeschool partnerships begin with building a deep sense of trust and inclusion. That takes time to build. The goal of creating a working group should always be to empower multi-diverse administrators, teachers, staff, parents, guardians, caregivers, and students' sense of safety, belonging, value, and competence, and the confidence to speak up about issues that are important to ourselves and to others. While many schools have parents and guardians who seem to naturally gravitate to being involved with us, and we, for the most part, really appreciate their involvement, we have to be vigilant to supporting multi-diverse members to really partner with us. Just as we want all of our students to be empowered, we want the same for all of our families, especially the ones who've been reluctant or may feel disconnected from us. It means really developing a strategic and intentional process of forming working groups or teams that truly draw from the multi-diversity of our school community to create mutually beneficial relationships rather than hierarchical ones that really support students socially, emotionally, and academically. A great example of what we are referring to is Wolf Street School in Baltimore, Maryland, a school in an urban setting. Wolf Street wanted to create after-school programming. To do this, they involved a working group of students, parents, staff, and members from the local community and created after-school activities that the students were interested in participating. From their working together, when a shooting happened in the same neighborhood as the school is located, parents from multi-diverse groups who had not been involved with the school beforehand led Wolf Street in engaging the police department and enacting a school-wide response to support everyone, every child and family and staff to feel safe. Examples such as Wolf Street really show us what's possible when we work together, when we're in it together on behalf of student safety, sense of belonging, interests, hopes, dreams, and of course, their success in school and in their lives.
Powerful, practical information, strategies, approaches to the reason why we're here today, to create identity-safe spaces at home and school. Thank you so much, Becky, Debbie, Audra, and Vinny, for partnering with the AFT to highlight real solutions for kids and families, and for providing these tried and true evidence-based, research-based practices to sustain equitable learning communities. I took so much away from this information. I'm just going to say like a couple of words that stood out. Of course, multi-diverse, colorblind teaching, we're ever evolving individuals. And so we have so many identities within us and that are being shaped and formed, and how important that is to not subscribing to that single story by just going by what you see, what you heard, what you read. Vinny, thank you for dispelling the myths and just like interrupting that cycle of thought about how we're inoculating children and how this happens and so they're going to be. Thank you so much for your bravery, being with us, and empowering us to do better. As Maya Angelou says, when you know better, do better. I could go on and on, but I know our time is limited. The practical strategies that Becky and Debbie shared with the working group, asset-based teaching, the research behind identity-safe spaces, and just I could go on, but guess what? We have 3 more episodes so that we can go on and empower our communities to do this work. Thank you so much. And thank you to our audience for joining us today for episode 1 of Identity-Affirming Classrooms Team Thought Partner Series. So what's next? You'll want to join us next week as we talk about supporting positive identity development and understanding our own identity. Place, same time, be on the lookout for information on how to participate in an X chat so that we can talk about this conversation we've been having today. Also, we want to make sure that you finish the exit, you do the exit ticket that we made available. We really want to hear about what resonated with you and the strategies that you plan to implement personally or in your professional setting. And also, we want to find out what promising practices are you using in your work setting, in your school, in your home. Make sure to download your certificate and check out the supporting resources that we have along with this episode. And thank you so much, everyone. Be well, go forth, and continue to carry out the mission of overcoming inequities.